All right, so I guess we'll start. This is going up on my channel, so hopefully everyone knows who I am. But in case not, I'm Cap Bergerson, and I make Zelda videos, mostly focusing on things that interest me, like dungeons and level design. But sometimes I talk about lore and theories and stuff when that interests me. Lorulean, for those who may not know you, why don't you go and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Cap. My name is Lorulean Historian, and I am a self-taught expert on all things Zelda lore. I do translation work, looking at the Japanese to English localization, lost in translation moments. And I've been a fan of the series for pretty much all of my life, and I try to help out wherever I can, and I have an active Twitter and Discord server. It's a lot of fun.
I can confirm he is the man, for those who don't know. And we're also joined by the marvelous Wiz. Go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Second of all, Lorulean is a paragon. Don't let him fool you any other way. Definitely a hero. yeah, definitely. Which is what you want from any hero. But yeah, I'm Wiz Catches Lightning. Been in the YouTube game for roughly just over 2.5 years. I was originally covering all sorts of video game related content, but the last couple of months, specifically around February, definitely got into Zelda with Tears of the Kingdom on the horizon, and made some videos that did fairly well. And I like to theorize about Zelda. I've used Lorulean's translations for some of my content, and it's been really helpful. And excited to delve deeper, look into the mysteries, and talk anything Zelda. So
yeah, man, and it's good stuff. I would encourage anyone watching or listening to this to go check out Wiz's channel. He gets deep into it, as I think I would say all of us here do. That's why we selected this panel, I would say. So
thank you.
And we were meant to be joined by Moxie Watts, who has vanished and is probably trapped in the silent realm as we speak. So whenever she finishes finding the Tears of Light and reemerges into the physical plane, she may or may not join us. So we'll carry on in the meantime. Yeah, so I've got a few list of topics. I thought we might as well just get into it. I will say, as a heads up to anyone listening, there will be spoilers for Tears of the Kingdom in this conversation. We've all finished the game here, I assume, at this point. I'm pretty sure I was the last one out of us to finish it. Because it was 3 days ago that I finished it. Yeah,
better late than never.
Yeah. I was savoring it, taking my time, and then I reloaded. Now I'm gonna go back to try and get that 100%. But I got the story done, so I can finally actually talk to people about this stuff. But yes, this is your spoiler warning for those watching. Heed this warning. We're gonna get into the end game. We're gonna get into continuity, deep lore, theory territory.
Can I ask real quick?
Yeah.
What are your both of? I guess this question is for both of you. What are your favorite Zelda games? And I guess maybe a little explanation as to why.
Oh,
jeez.
Ooh, I'll let Lorulean go first with that one.
Well, Ocarina of Time was the first game that really got me into the series. I had played A Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo and thought it was a really fun game, but didn't really think much of it. So Ocarina of Time holds a special place in my heart. I was really excited to play it. I would spend hours playing it at my friend's in the basement on an old tube TV, because that's what you did back in the 90s. I was really excited to see the 3DS remake of it that came out in, was it 2010? Pretty sure it was 2011.
Maybe 2010.
Came out with the advent of the 3DS is what I recall.
Yeah, and that was fun. I really enjoyed that game. So that holds a special place in my heart. Other than that, I mean, they're all fantastic games, but the Wind Waker, I really like how quirky and charming its aesthetic is, but also how gritty and down to earth its storytelling is. I found it a very mature game, even though it had such colorful characters. So that holds a pretty big place for me as well. Yeah, I love Twilight Princess. I'm gonna say that too. Twilight Princess was great, but I found it very, I guess, derivative. It seemed like Ocarina of Time, but grittier, and I liked that. And so that one's a really important one for me too. But like in terms of gameplay, I was like, eh. It's more the story arc and whatnot that I really enjoy with that one and the characters. But the Minish Cap, I love the Minish Cap. I don't know, like, it's just such a fun game to play. I've replayed that so many times I've lost count.
Wow.
So that one's my quirky little favorite, but
it's all good choices. There's no wrong answer here as well. Like there's I don't think there's a bad Zelda game, so like there's no there's no way to go wrong.
The Triforce Heroes.
You're right. I always push that one out of my memory. That's
Itopia.
It was
it's a thing.
I was on
that one
Triforce Trends channel. We did this big trivia contest with a bunch of Zelda tubers, and I think I did pretty well. I mean, I won, but one of the questions was just straight up like, what's the name of the main villain in Triforce Heroes? And I just like had so pushed that game out of my brain that I like couldn't even remember. Even now talking about it, I still can't remember what her name was. I just always forget the game exists. So there's mostly no wrong answers, we'll say.
Lady Maud, apparently. Maud.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will forget that by the end of this conversation, but
I didn't even know it. I had to look it up.
There you go.
Yeah, Lady Maud.
No, I always struggle with the question of like, what's my favorite Zelda game? Like that, I don't know.
Tough one.
It is a tough question because there's a lot of. I love them all. I love the game so much. Like, and I think similar to Lorulean, like A Link to the Past was my first Zelda game that I ever played. And being a 90s baby, I was too young at the time to really like play it well. So Ocarina of Time was like the first game that I like properly like was like good enough to actually play and beat on my own. So that also will always hold a special place. But they both will always hold a special place in my heart. But I don't know. Maybe it's too soon to say Tears of the Kingdom is my favorite. Maybe it's too soon, but I might need to like contemplate on it more. But they're all fair. Fantastic games, mostly.
Sure.
Except for that one. But how about you, Wiz?
For me, well, Ocarina of Time was my intro to the series. It was like 98. I remember this vividly. It was 1998. Went up to my cousin's house to celebrate Christmas with them. They were up in Minnesota. They were at the final dungeon, and it wasn't their first time fighting Ganondorf. So they beat Ganondorf, and then I was like, oh, can I try playing? And my cousin just handed me the controller, and he was like, yeah, have fun. Go at it. And so I got to navigate Zelda down through the crumbling Hyrule Castle.
Oh, that was your introduction. Wow.
That was my introduction to the series. Got into the final battle with Ganon. Got to see... the entire celebration at the end, and it captivated my 6 or 7 year old self. I'm terrible at math, but I was around that age. Yeah, it blew me away. And then, like you both, Link to the Past was actually the very first Zelda game that I actually fully played, and I actually thought that was like the first game in the series, but obviously I was wrong. Got it on the Game Boy Advance, so the Four Swords version of the game. And Bergerson, you were talking about this in your Thieves Hideout dungeon video. You're like, yeah, I'm not really sure if there's like a story clue or a gameplay clue about how to open up this dungeon, but I just pulled at it. I'm pretty sure I did the same thing as a kid. Like, no one told you like how to get into that dungeon. That's just like how you do it. So that was really cool.
You just know somehow.
yeah. It's just intuition or whatever, and But if I had to pinpoint it, I would say my favorite is still between Wind Waker and Skyward Sword. Wind Waker for the reasons that Lorulean mentioned. In addition to that, I would say, it's kind of like, I guess a lot of Zelda games have post-apocalyptic like scenarios or settings or like a fall of like civilization, but you really feel it in Wind Waker because you're like this, you wake up and you're like, this isn't Hyrule. And like, there's like this legend that's passed down where this island of boys, when they reach, a certain age, they don the heroes of the hero's clothing. And they partake in this ritual as kind of like a callback to something that used to be. And you have to navigate this world, and it's just unfamiliar as all heck. And that fascinated me as a kid. And then, meanwhile, you're like exploring these forums in real life, and everyone's like, well, what the heck's going on here? Was there a split? There has to be a split, right? Like something happened, which kind of led to me discovering the timeline as a whole. And then I think that led to just a greater appreciation of Skyward Sword. I know a lot of people take issue with its gameplay, but I didn't own a Wii. My cousins owned a Wii, so I sourced a Wii from them by going over to their house. I would because I just had my driver's license. Borrowed the game from a friend. So the friend had just beaten the game, and he was like, "You gotta play this. I'm gonna let you borrow it." I was like, "Cool." And on the weekends, I would drive over to my cousin's and play the game, and eventually got to the point where it's like I'm spending like 6-7 hours in my aunt's basement. So she was like, you want to just take the Wii with you? I was like, really? And she's like, yeah. And so I think for that reason, it holds a special place in my heart, and also just like, I don't know, I just thought it was like very intuitive and smart.
Yeah.
Young Impa telling you failed. When you complete the second dungeon, like that was like the punch to the gut that I needed, because like I remember vividly struggling against Girahim. I must have spent like 5 or 6 hours trying to beat him the first time I ever fought him.
Oh, damn.
And then you get through the fire temple, like that's a breeze, but then you get told this statement like, hey, like everything you're doing, it's not adequate, it's not good enough. And like that filled me with determination to like get better at the game, and then you eventually get better at the game, and you uncover all these mysteries that you've been kind of wondering about since you've played all the games in the series, and then you get to the end and you have that light bulb moment when you're fighting the final boss, in order to beat the final boss, and it was just the perfect ending for me. So yeah, that's why it's tough. Both those games hold a very special place in my heart, for certain.
Yeah. It's funny is that thinking about just the series as a whole, I can pinpoint basically any Zelda game and be like, each one of them also kind of line up or mark like a moment of my life that I kind of can look back on fondly with that game. Like Skyward Sword, for example, was the first Zelda game that I owned after moving out from home and living on my own. So it was like the first Zelda game I played living on my own as like a bachelor, basically. So
nice.
Coming home from work, booting up the Wii, and I worked at a movie theater. It was like my first job, right? And then like booting up the Wii and staying up like to outrageous hours, like 4 a.m. just like playing Skyward Sword, and then sleeping until noon, and then getting up and going to work again and rinse repeat. Right? So it's like, but I can kind of pinpoint like different. Twilight Princess was like the first Zelda game I played in high school, for example. Yeah. So it's like they kind of line up with like landmarks of my life in a way, and I can kind of look back on Zelda as this persistent force throughout my life. So it's very nostalgic is an overused word sometimes, but it is nostalgic. I love that.
Absolutely.
That brings us to perhaps our first proper topic, we'll say, where we're gonna really get into spoilery stuff. I made a list here, you guys. I put it in the chat here. I guess where would be the best place to start? And I think I'm gonna just go ahead and say Tears of the Kingdom and the Zelda timeline might be the best place to start here. So,
ooh,
just because I think it's a conversation I want to have. I mean, I want to have all.
We're not gonna mince words here,
but also it's. Probably going to be like the longest topic, so we might as well like dig into it right away so we have time.
That's fair.
Yeah. So, and the Bargainers, I think Mox specifically requested to talk about, and she's not here yet, so we definitely don't want to start there. So
that's fair.
Yeah. So for those who haven't gotten this far in the game, you shouldn't be watching this video. but just in case you're still here, or you just need a refresh, Tears of the Kingdom kind of takes place in 2 time periods. We ourselves as a player, as Link, do not time travel. We rather recover memories, not unlike how we did in Breath of the Wild. Mm-hmm. And Zelda has been transported to the ancient past of Hyrule's founding and met the supposedly first king and queen of Hyrule, Rauru and Sonia, who is not a Zonai, even though Sonia is spelled weirdly similar to Zonai. So there's a few trains of thought about, is this truly like between Skyward Sword and Minish Cap era of founding? Is this a refounding of Hyrule? Is this a completely separate continuity? I've heard all sorts of arguments about all sorts of trains of thought. But I would love to get into it with you guys here. So since Wiz just muted himself, Lorulean, why don't you go ahead and start?
That was not planned, by the way. My cat is meowing.
Oh, don't you dare mute the cat. No,
he's a little house lion.
But yeah, Lorulean, let's just jump in. What are your thoughts? What's happening with this game and the timeline?
From my understanding, looking at both the English and the Japanese canon, from the dialogue of Rauru and Sonia, Zelda, Pura, the works, it seems to reiterate time and time again that it is the founding of the Kingdom of Hyrule, and it is the first king and queen. With a name like Rauru and being a sage and a king or a kingly figure of light, as well as there being a Temple of Time associated with him and his wife. They mention a great evil or a monstrous force that was attacking the kingdom prior that they helped to subdue. It all seems to point to like the era of prosperity between Skyward Sword and the Minish Cap. Then there are a bunch of other little contextual clues, like Ganondorf, who we see in these past memories, is flanked by 2 women who happen to have...
I'm glad you brought this up, because I did want to mention this. But go on, please.
Yeah, so he's flanked by 2 women in 2 different memories. So in one memory, they are wearing these gold masks, hiding a lot of the features of their face. But in the other memory, when they're in the throne room of the castle of that era, you can see as they're kneeling there behind Ganondorf that they have sashes around their necks. One is in red, one is in blue, and they say TotK and Koume, which are the names of the witches who raised Ganondorf in Ocarina of Time, also known as Twin Rova. They're about 400 years old during the events of Ocarina of Time, which we know is fairly early on in Hyrule's history, but not like
one
right there at the beginning.
And the other one is 398.
Yes, but they argue about
dialogue.
It's great dialogue, but they're supposed to be twins, so they have to be the same age.
Yes, no, that was a joke.
But anyway,
because, just a little reference to their death dialogue. But yes.
But in these memories, they don't look anything close to even 100 years of age, right? They look maybe in their 40s, if anything. Like, they don't have a lot of defining like older or senior characteristics. They seem to be maybe middle-aged. So if they are indeed the same Koume and TotK, then this takes place centuries before Ocarina of Time, which would also, again, fall in line with the era of prosperity and the little bit that we know of it through not just supplemental material like the Historia or the Encyclopedia, but also little bits of dialogue and lore from games like Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. So it seems to indicate that is the era, or at least it's strongly suggesting that is the era in which that's taking place. Which is insane, because the present day of Tears of the Kingdom takes place tens of thousands of years after any of that. I mean, pretty much all of the games that we're aware of are referred to as myths and legends in their historical records. Like,
True.
Their history is so muddled, they don't even know for sure what happened.
Yeah, but
That's
in one of the memories. Zelda
insane.
specifically states, "Oh, this is the era of of myth, a place so long ago in the past." Like she uses that exact phrasing as well, and I'm glad. Yeah, I'm aligned with that. That's been my standpoint as well, and I'm so glad you brought up Kume and Kotake, because I think they are the same ones that were in Ocarina of Time in their younger years as well. And the Rauru we meet in Ocarina of Time is, of course, not the same Rauru, but just a Sage of Light named, in honor of this Rauru. Because names can, like there's family names and things that. I think he probably was of some nobility or a relative of the royal family, but not like in line for the throne necessarily, or something to that effect.
Potentially.
I mean, he's a bit of a vague character. He just shows up and he's mentioned quite a lot in Hyrule Historia as being significant for building the Temple of Time. Makes me wonder if he built it at that site because his namesake had a different Temple of Time already built there, right? So continuity and the timeline kind of shifts as new games have to be added in as well.
Of course.
So, we have to take that into account. Like, we can't take Hyrule Historia as gospel for not accounting for Tears of the Kingdom when the game was written, or sorry, the book was written 12 years ago. So, yeah. I think there's a lot to indicate as well that it's around that time. And there's some interesting things. Like I noticed Dueling Peaks is just one mountain in those memories. But you get like Death Mountain has that token iconic ring cloud, which we never see in Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom and looking like that, but it very much calls back to the era of Ocarina of Time. Yeah, and even just the placement of the castle. Yeah, it all seems to call back to that era. And I think many people assumed that Link and Zelda from Skyward Sword would go on to become the first king and queen, but technically that was an assumption we kind of collectively made, and it was never said outright. They, in the game they just stay to watch over the Triforce. So yes, please.
Neither of them really came from any sort of background that would like make them suitable rulers either. I mean, Zelda was the daughter of a headmaster.
Yeah.
And Link was just a knight. I mean, there's no concept of royalty or of like monarchy or anything like that. They came from an egalitarian like society, an idyllic society in the sky, right? So
true.
It doesn't make sense that they would just all of a sudden decide, hey, we're gonna, it seemed to me even playing that game, I figured like a descendant of theirs at some point,
who could be
rallied the people together and founded the kingdom. And yeah, Sonia could be that descendant. It would be fitting.
Yeah. Wiz, you haven't had a chance, sorry, to get a word in here, so I apologize, but
no, I think everything you're laying out is pretty valid. I disagree, but this.
I was kind of hoping that someone would, because I think the conversation is more interesting that way. So
yeah,
go ahead.
Well, I guess. I have to. I don't even know. I just pulled up like my script that I'm working on for my current video to like organize my thoughts as you guys were talking. So I'm very glad you took the time to speak, because there's things we have to acknowledge and it's all important. And I promise I'm not trying to be contrarian, because at like a week and a half ago, I totally agreed with everything that you guys are saying. And then I looked like further and I'm like, there's things I can't reconcile. And I looked even further into that and I came to some conclusions. So like maybe this is going to act as like a sneak peek to what I'm going to get into in my next video. Same shameless self-plug, I suppose, but I'm not really trying to self-plug.
No, self-plug away. Everyone, sub to Wiz. So
well, thank you. Okay, so I guess first we have to establish, like, because people have argued that the history of Tears of the Kingdom could take place before Skyward Sword, and I can't agree with that, even though that would be cool, for a couple reasons. I guess the first reason would be Fi speaking to Zelda, or Fi, however you say her name. For me, it's Fi, because I can't shake my my Latin teachings that I learned growing up. So with Fi, she like speaks to Zelda, which the Master Sword wasn't created before Skyward Sword, and people are like, well, there is no Master Sword in Skyward Sword, or I'm sorry, there's no Master Sword spoken about in the history of Tears of the Kingdom. So people have used that as like a main point, but it's like it wasn't even known as the Master Sword in like Skyward Sword before it became the Master Sword. It was known as like the Goddess White Sword. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And also Zelda, there's a specific scene when Link pulls the Master Sword and you see the spirit of Zelda, and she says, Link, take the Master Sword, defeat Ganondorf, the Demon King. Or she says, Zelda says specifically, she is the key to defeating the Demon King. So she's referring to Fi. We've always known Fi as like a female spirit of like the Master Sword. So that's one reason why I can't place the history of Tears of the Kingdom before Skyward Sword. I guess the second reason would be Ganondorf's appearance when he takes the original recall tear, or I guess the tear from Sonia after killing her. Sonia's name is very interesting. If you look at the etymology of it, you can derive two meanings. The first meaning is wisdom, because people say that Sonia is I guess a new age version of saying Sophia. The Greek word for wisdom is Sophos, and I guess it somehow later became Sonia. Sophia turned into Sonia, but to me, I take Sonia to actually be derived more completely from the Greek word sonos, which means sound. And that to me makes more sense because in a lot of Zelda games, you have these instruments that you use to commune with the gods, so to speak, the deities of the world, and you have these instruments that are capable of taking Link back in time, capable of taking him to like heal, certain maladies that Ganondorf or insert demonic figure here has caused in the world. You use these musical instruments to kind of rectify the situation and to bring about magic. But it can also take on a meaning of echoes. So like echoes through time. And there's this theme, this phrase that I've talked about quite a bit in some of my videos, and it's history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure likes to rhyme. So I use that as like the placeholder phrase for kind of like delving into this whole lorescape and really trying to get to the truth of the matter. To support the theory that the history of Tears of the Kingdom takes place before Ocarina of Time, I would also add that people ask the question or they challenge it with how can there be two Ganondorfs at once? Like what? We've got this Ganondorf that's just underneath Hyrule Castle for all these years, and we have Ganondorf Dragmire appear all of a sudden. You can explain that with the in Lorulean, feel free to correct me if you know about this, with the Japanese word tamashi, which is like, it means spirit or soul. But there's this notion, Quest with Aaron, great YouTuber, talks about the notion that the tamashi can exist in two hosts at the same time, like two candles sharing the same flame. There's an example we've seen of this if you accept this as part of the canon of Zelda, and that is Link from Twilight Princess and the Hero Shade. If you can accept that the Hero Shade was the hero of time, who went back into the child timeline, and according to him could not pass on his teachings to someone, so he became what was known as I believe a bure, which is someone who's I guess negative feelings keep them bound to the plane of existence.
Yep.
And okay, thank you. I don't want to be talking out of my butt here, but they can basically these negative feelings hold that spirit onto that plane of existence, and it's only once Link goes and learns the teachings that the Hero Shade has to pass on, that the Hero Shade can then pass on, can rest in peace, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that could explain how we have a Ganondorf just chilling underneath, sealed underneath Hyrule Castle for all this time, while we have Ganondorf Dragmire running around. The two main things that I have a hard time reconciling with Tears of the Kingdom's history taking place before Ocarina of Time are the existence of the Rito and what's going on, I guess the physical traits of the Gerudo specifically. So I guess it's probably easier, maybe, I guess, to start with the Rito.
Right.
But the Rito were first introduced to them in Wind Waker. A lot of people explain it like this: the Zora were freshwater creatures. If you look into the relationship of how kami, how deities or guardian spirits, engage with the creatures, the living creatures that they watch over or they guard, there seems to be this really interesting relationship. The Kokiri are told not to leave the Lost Woods at the beginning of Ocarina of Time, because if they do, they will die, which is pretty dramatic. Like, if you leave this forest, you're just going to die. I think a better interpretation is if you leave this forest, you're going to actually start aging, and then you'll die eventually.
Right. And
I don't remember where I read this or where I saw this, so forgive me. But essentially, I'll continue explaining this a little bit further. Mm-hmm. The Great Deku Tree, the one that's had the curse placed on him, is essentially dying. And we know this because he dies after Link goes and gets the Sacred Stone from him after he defeats Goma. He dies, some time passes, you eventually have to go to the Forest Temple. Saria becomes the Sage of the Forest, awakens as the Sage of the Forest, and the Great Deku Tree Sprout is born. Essentially, I guess my understanding is that the Great Deku Tree has this area of effect, life force, we'll call it, or I don't know what else not life force, like he is like his life force and he's living, but it's connected to that. More so, he gives off this area of effect magic, and that's what causes the Kokiri not to age. When he's cursed, the diameter of his area of effect life force magic diminishes in such a way that it's only reserved to the boundaries of the Lost Woods. And he dies, and obviously there's no magic at that point. But then when Saria wakes up as the Sage, and when the Great Deku Tree sprouts, that area of effect magic is back again, and it's greater in magnitude, which is why we see Koroks in Wind Waker planting these seeds all around the world of Wind Waker, because the magic has extended in such a way that they're able to leave the boundaries of Kokiri Forest from Ocarina of Time onward, from the adult timeline.
Right.
The same also happens with Mido, or Mido, however you want to pronounce it, during the celebration at the end of the game.
That's true.
He's at Lon Lon Ranch with King Zora.
Oh yeah, yes.
That's true.
Thank you for saying that. I didn't even think about that. That's true. So with the Rito specifically, it's very heavily implied, if not outright stated, that the Rito are descendants of the Zora. But according to some sort of interview, I don't remember the source, pulling completely from memory here. According to some interview with Shigeru Miyamoto and Eiji Aonuma, Wind Waker is set to take place 100 years after the events of the adult timeline in Ocarina of Time. And so you're like, all right, how the heck? How? How did the Zora transform into the Rito or evolve into the Rito in such a short time that defies all rules of biology? And the way that we explain that is with Valoo, who would be the kami or the guardian spirit of Dragon Roost Island. The Rito directly mention having a relationship with this guardian deity in such a way that they can't fly until they've acquired a scale from him, when they are of age. Without that scale, the Rito can't fly. So that really paints that dynamic, and it helps explain how we get from freshwater Zora, who wouldn't survive in a saltwater climate due to what we know about freshwater fish, and basically becoming the Rito. Another thing that I forgot to mention that was explained to me or I read somewhere was that I guess the Zora in Ocarina of Time can only leave the water for extended periods of time because of their relationship with Jabu Jabu.
Okay.
Otherwise they would have to remain in the water at all times, like fish would have to. But because they have this relationship that's similar to the dynamic that the Kokiri experience with the Great Deku Tree and the Great Deku Sprout, they're actually able to exist outside of the water without having to go back in all the time or having to be in the water at all times. So that's an interesting relationship. Where are you going with this, Wiz?
Wiz asked himself.
The Rito. Yeah. If you look at the Rito and you look at creating a champion specifically, there's this one page, I can't remember where it is, but it's a collage of the Rito essentially. And there's these descriptions, and they talk about how the Rito can't see at night, and how they, obtain prey, like the food of prey, much similar to like how Hylians consume food of prey or something like that. So initially, I was thinking like, all right, did a Hylian like make some love with a Loftwing or something like that, because the Loftwings are described as not being able to see at night, and I guess what happened. And I'm trying to say this as appropriately as possible, so forgive me here. But it's like, what happened? Like, right. I do see some similarities with the Loftwings. Like, what's going on here? If you look at the Skyloftian crest that Kaipora Gabora wears, it looks like the precursor to even like the Rito like crest. When you look at the Rito crest and you transpose that against the Skyloftian crest, the devs even mention, that the Hylians of Skyloft specifically were made with an intention, like their character design is with an intention of looking like birds essentially, and some of them have like bird names, like I believe there's like Owlin and whatnot.
Yeah. And Aegis is one
so
of the
that's
features.
Rich, Henna, yeah.
Exactly.
Almost everyone is named after a bird except for Link and Zelda, basically.
Link and Zelda, yeah.
And then like the Loftwings just like kind of disappear, just like the Magma disappear, just like the Perella, I guess, evolve into what we know as the Zora, like later on. But yeah, there's this. It's like I couldn't rectify that in my head, and I gotta give a shout out to the YouTube channel Gamesmiths. He pointed me in this direction, and he's definitely an underrated channel. Really awesome dude. Great OG fan. Played since the first Zelda, and he pointed me in this direction as far as like asking the questions. But he showed me this collage picture for creating a champion, and it shows you a couple things. It shows you the Loftwings. It gives you some descriptions that are very curious after you read them a couple times and you really sit and let the information digest. And he shows you even shows you, I guess, the precursor drawing for Cass. Hopefully Cass is still alive, and we'll see him in some DLC or something like that.
Yeah.
But it shows you Cass, what looks like Cass, but also looks like Sidon. Like, has like the Sidon ascot and everything, has Cass's beak. It's a red bird with like a white belly. And you start to like ask these questions, and then you look at their eyes. Like, you look at the Rito's eyes. Specifically, look at Tulin. And look at Tulin's parents. So Teba and Saki. Teba and Saki have very different eyes. If you look at Saki's eyes, you can see that Tulin gets his eyes probably from her. If you compare that against a Loftwing, really looks like a Loftwing. Like the eyes of a Loftwing. If you look at Teba's eyes, he has these very distinct yellow eyes. Almost with like serpent pupils in a way. And if you look at, and then if you look at Teba and you look at Sidon, their eyes are almost indistinguishable. They look like they have the same exact eyes. So I made the inference that the history of Tears of the Kingdom of Breath of the Wild acknowledges that there was a merging at some point. Like, to say that the Hylians and the Loftwings somehow had a consummated marriage relationship at some point, I'm not sure if I believe that. That could be just like a total
I would rather
red herring.
say that the Loftwings just evolved.
Sorry. I'm not trying to rule 34 this or anything.
Yeah. I feel like that's maybe a more appropriate and likely explanation.
I'm just explaining this because like it was like it just didn't make sense to me. But then when I look at Sidon and I look at Teba, I'm like, oh my gosh. Sidon almost looks like he could be a long lost ancestor of Teba because of the eyes that they share. And if you throw this up against the history of Breath of the Wild, or I guess if you throw this up with Wind Waker, like discovering the Rito and Wind Waker, and then you accept that Breath of the Wild takes place after Wind Waker among two other parallel timelines at some point, that's how I'm getting to where I'm getting. so to speak. So hopefully I didn't just confuse everyone. But
and I've got a few points to kind of add on to what you're saying.
Yeah.
But if you wanna wrap up your train of thought first.
So just to let you know, explaining the Rito and how this makes some curiosities, and then next I was going to cover the Gerudo, but I am happy to pass the baton.
Yeah, well, we'll baton it back and forth a bit. I guess.
Yeah.
But a thought is, as soon as you mentioned the Rito, my thought was initially, I don't think the Rito that we know in Tears of the Kingdom Breath of the Wild are the same race of Rito as were in Wind Waker. But now you've kind of changed my line of thinking about it a little bit, talking about a convergence of races. But yeah, the Rito, obviously in Wind Waker, as we introduced it, they were directly descended of the Zora of that timeline.
But were they?
But I mean, at the very least, we know for sure Medley's ancestor was Laruto, who was the Zora. Mm-hmm. And the Rito crest in Wind Waker is just straight up the Zora crest. But
true.
The Rito and Zora coexist in Breath of the Wild, and apparently in the era of Hyrule's founding, they also both existed. So I think what is potentially the case is that the term Rito in universe is just a Hylian word that essentially means like birdman or bird person, and it's just a name that was assigned to both races, but they're not necessarily the same race of Rito between Wind Waker's and the new Breath of the Wild Tears of the Kingdom Rito. And I think that maybe more interestingly is the idea of the races converging to have those Rito Wind Waker bird people and a original Rito race kind of came together and melded into one race of bird people. Because the Rito are not just like one type of bird either. We've got, Cass is like a toucan.
You have the owl type.
You got, Canelli.
I forget his name.
Canelli.
Yeah, he's like an owl.
Thank you.
Hawks and so there are many different types of birds basically. So I think that makes sense as the idea of like because I wouldn't just say that I subscribe to the timeline convergence theory. I'd like to think that I kind of popularized it back in 2016. The what's commonly called the Dragon Break theory.
Yes.
Yeah, and so obviously like that my belief has always been that Breath of the Wild is at the tail end of a timeline convergence of all the Zelda timelines. And the reason I think that is because there's so much evidence you could argue for any of the timelines, and I just don't like ignoring evidence in favor of whatever I like better, because then it'll nag me. It's like, well, but what about this? Like there's that voice in the back of my head, but what about that? So convergence is the thing that makes the most sense to me, especially because timeline convergences happen already in the Zelda series. My favorite example is the ending of Majora's Mask is a timeline convergence, like 100%, because you go through all these 3-day cycles and you do all these things, and technically those should all be separate timelines. But when you roll credits on the game, that credit cutscene, every side quest you finished is completed. All the dungeons are completed. So all of those things happened. So the only explanation, it's a timeline convergence of all those 3-day cycles. So it's not like it's an impossible thing in the series. It's an established idea that can happen. The Rito in Breath of the Wild's Creating a Champion specifically has a page where all the sort of history of all the races of Hyrule are kind of laid out in a timeline on this page. And like the Gerudo and Zora have like references to Ocarina of Time in their pages, right? I think the Zora's section of that specifically mentions, Ganondorf showed up, Princess Ruto awakened as a sage and helped the hero of time of that era, or the hero of that era, and sealed away Ganon, and all this other stuff happened, and then now it's Mipha, and Vah Ruta was named after Ruto the sage. So all that stuff is pretty clearly laid out. Like Ocarina of Time for sure happened, especially the adult part of Ocarina of Time. The Rito section is notably sparse, as if 10,000 years before Breath of the Wild, they just poofed into existence, according to Creating a Champion. So they have no recorded history before that, or at least at that point. Obviously now it's different because they were around. But I think what it is potentially a case of is they were around in Hyrule, and there was a Rito Sage of Wind, but because they played no significant parts in a lot of Hyrule's history, they were kind of omitted from the history books in a lot of ways, sadly.
Like forgotten about.
Yeah, and the section of the map where they live is, in most games, not explored. Like, it's just an area Link doesn't seem to go to very much, or doesn't seem to need to.
I mean, even with the name, like Tabantha Frontier, it's a frontier. It's a wilderness. It's out in the boonies. It's far removed from civilization. So
an interesting thing though is in Minish Cap, the area, the Castor Wilds, is called the Tabantha Wilds in Japanese, is it not?
Yeah, it's the Tabantha Hikyo, which is the Tabantha Wilderness, Tabantha Wilds.
Right.
So yeah, there's a reference there, and even then a
whole separate theory.
It's in the middle of nowhere.
Is a whole separate theory that I think might tickle your fancy, Lorulean. But I'll just tell you, and we'll move on. But headcanon of mine has always been that the ancient columns in the Tabantha frontier are actually the remnants of the wind ruins from Minish Cap, which architecturally are pretty similar. And if, these are both areas called Tabantha, it's like basically all that's left of those really ancient wind ruins of where the Wind Tribe took off. That's just been my headcanon.
Makes sense.
But
it's one I've subscribed to for a long time as well. I've posted a lot about it on my Instagram and on my Twitter a few years back. But yeah, it's definitely something that I've considered, and I think is kind of fitting.
I think it fits. Yeah, it's and after all this time, like there's just not much left of it. But but yeah. Anyways, the Rito. I keep getting sidetracked. I'm so sorry.
No worries. I was gonna ask, is Tabantha a reference to Minish Cap, because I have not completed that game?
So there's an area in Minish Cap you'll get to. It's called the Castor Wilds in English, but the Japanese version, that area is called the Tabantha Wilds, basically.
Okay, for sure. Thank you for catching me up to speed. I just wanted to make sure I was following along.
So when you play Minish Cap and you get to that point, just keep that in the back of your head, and then you'll start drawing connections to like, this place in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom was almost certainly like the same place. But yeah, the Rito.
The Rito.
I don't think it's unlikely that maybe the Loftwings evolved, or maybe the Rito were a surface race that maybe just didn't have as much of a hand in the involvement of a lot of Hyrule's history, aside from these events that we've seen. They could have just been doing their own thing, or living their lives in the sky, or who knows. But
100%.
Personally, I don't necessarily see their existence as necessitating it not being or like proving that it can't be that era of prosperity, but it's
no, for sure.
It is an interesting
it's one part to a two-parter.
Right. Well, you were going to shift gears to the Gerudo, I guess. So,
yes. So with the Gerudo specifically, in all of the cutscenes that we see them for the history of Tears of the Kingdom, they have green eyes and they have pointed ears. And to me, as someone who's like really interested in biology and principles of evolution and whatnot, that doesn't make sense to place the history of Tears of the Kingdom before Ocarina of Time. And because they have green eyes and they have pointed ears, Kome and TotK even have green eyes, and they have pointed ears. We can't see their eyes. I guess we have to assume that they have green eyes. But in Ocarina of Time, they have round ears and they have topaz eyes. Ganondorf in Ocarina of Time has round ears and pointed eyes, I guess, up until round ears and topaz eyes is what I meant to say. People have speculated on this, and it kind of shows with continuity that at some point after Ganondorf gets the Triforce, his ears change from round to pointed. I don't know if that's how we explain that through lore, other than maybe he had the Triforce and he was closer to the gods at that point. I don't know if either of you have any speculation on why that is, but you can clearly see in Wind Waker. Yeah, in Wind Waker and in Twilight Princess, he has pointed ears instead of like round ears at the beginning of Ocarina of Time.
Pretty sure Twilight Princess, he still has round ears.
They have a little pointed tip, but
okay.
they're not Hylian like long pointed ears, but they have like almost like an elf tip on them.
And now hear me out. Is this a point of them only having so many polygons, or is this a point of them actually you know what I think the illustrations are going to give us a better idea. I'm just going to quickly find some official art to double check here, because okay, you're right. I will concede this point. He does seem to have, like you said, pointed. They're not like long Hylian ears, but they are definitely pointed, which in Ocarina of Time they are definitely polygonal but round. Yeah, so okay. No, that's a legit point. Please do go on.
I was just gonna say, so Ganondorf in the history of Tears of the Kingdom, he has round ears and he has topaz eyes. Genetically or biologically speaking, we could surmise that that's a sex-linked recessive trait, much like how men inherit color blindness from their mothers, but their mothers don't have color blindness. That's like a pretty popular sex-linked inherited trait. And then, when only one Gerudo male is born every 100 years to the Gerudo tribe, there isn't really enough room to deviate from that genetic outcome. But, symbolically speaking, we could explain that Ganondorf is, his resemblance is like this because he's a reincarnation of the Ganondorf who came before him, who I am stating is Ganondorf Dragmire. So he's a reincarnation of him, and in the history of Breath of the Wild, or maybe it's said in like Creating a Champion, Gerudo males stopped being born after the Ganondorf who became the Calamity. So I guess I'm assuming that Ganondorf Dragmire wasn't the source of the Calamity. It was Ganondorf from Tears of the Kingdom that was the source of the Calamity. And that technically Ganondorf Dragmire couldn't be born after Ganondorf from Tears of the Kingdom if this was the case.
Okay.
So
I could talk upon this if you wanted me to.
Yes. Yeah.
In English and in the Japanese, because I've compared the two. I have both physical copies for Masterworks and Creating a Champion.
Love the dedication.
Yes, I know. It's fantastic. So looking at that quote about the fairy tale of Calamity Ganon, which is what it's referred to. It's called, the whole section is the fairy tale of Calamity Ganon and his ties to the Gerudo. It talks about their history, like a little bit of the historical records. It basically surmises that once upon a time, Gerudo males were born and they were by law made their kings. It then goes on to state that after the one that became the Calamity, no records show a Gerudo king. It doesn't specify or say anything about them not being born. It just says that they have not made any their king since the one that became the Calamity. We also, being 100 years between the past of Breath of the Wild and the current age of Breath of the Wild, may have missed any potential male child that could have been born, potentially. We also don't know what their rules or laws state regarding them in particular. Like, we know men or Vo aren't allowed into Gerudo Town by law, but those are basically anyone who's not Gerudo. What does it mean for an actual Gerudo Vo? We don't know. There's no way to sort of... Yeah.
There might be a single Gerudo male NPC in Breath of the Wild, and that might be Villia, who sells us the Gerudo Vi outfit. And I say might be, of course, it's not confirmed, but there's the skin tone, the red hair, the fact that he is clearly very accustomed with Gerudo culture and sneaks in and out of Gerudo Town. It kind of suggests to me that might be the case. I think a lot of people have this conflated idea, and I don't think anyone here in this conversation has this idea, but I've heard this online that every Gerudo male is Ganondorf. And I'm like, no. That's every Ganondorf is a Gerudo male, but not every Gerudo male every 100 years is Ganondorf.
There's a Venn diagram here.
Yeah,
it's correlation versus causation. There's a difference.
Yeah, exactly. But I think Creating a Champion and Masterworks and and I think Breath of the Wild in general was written with the intention that the Ganondorf we knew from the classic games is the same one that became the Calamity. And the supplementary material
as well
suggests that for sure. And I think they changed their mind creatively to have them be separate figures for Tears of the Kingdom. So some would consider it a retcon, but it would only retcons supplementary material, not necessarily the games, because all of those indicators appear in the books as opposed to in the game. Like Urbosa mentions the Calamity was once a Gerudo, and that's still true. Yeah, it is an interesting train of thought. But the ears thing that you brought up, Wiz, is interesting.
Yeah,
I
that's
believe
a really
creating
good
a
point.
champion explicitly says that like after the Gerudo basically cut ties with that law of making men their king, it's theorized in universe that they started having those pointed ears as a result of their quote-unquote enlightenment, or that it could be that just so many years of intermingling with Hylians ended up bringing that feature out in them. And them not having it in the past might be a contradiction. Definitely a reach on my part. I'm just going right into speculation territory.
Completely fine. Yeah.
But it could be, if we're going with the Enlightenment theory, that races with pointed ears are like more enlightened races, like Hylians, who have a closer relationship with gods. It could be that the Gerudo were initially, as surface dwellers in this ancient era, enlightened races, and when this Ganondorf in this ancient past, the new Ganondorf, rose to power and he became the Demon King, the Gerudo lost this feature, essentially. Like maybe the gods just stripped that from them. It said like, we're cutting ties with you basically for your race's blaspheme. And only later in history when the Gerudo basically learned and reconciled with their past of, even though technically it's not like all the Gerudo's crime that Ganondorf sucked and was a terrible dude, but the gods tend to do things in sweeping motions. So
the Great Flood.
So it could be that this was some kind of atonement or punishment brought on by the gods that changed the biology of the Gerudo to remove their pointed ears until they became re-enlightened in a sense. And again, this is so me just reaching just all the way into speculation. Yeah, but
totally. I was just gonna say, I don't. Biologically, it's hard for me to reconcile that specific detail.
Yeah, I had to pull that explanation out my ass, basically. So.
But hey, Rito, Zora can turn into Rito in less than 100 years' time. So it's not more. It's not outside the realm of possibilities.
That's true.
It's more than 100 years. That's the thing. So that's one of those lost in translation things. And it's also mentioned in the game, in the Wind Waker, that since the seal on Ganondorf and the seal on Hyrule was established, hundreds of years had passed before the present. The kanji for what would be 100 and then a modifier, the modifier basically refers to few or several. If it's in front of the kanji for 100 years, it means hundreds of years, plural. If it is after the kanji, it's a modifier that means 100 and some or 100 or so. So they're very physically similar. If you're not really looking at it, you just assume it's one or the other. And that seems to have been what took place with that interview when they were translating it. Somebody just looked at it, mistook the position of the modifier and assumed that they said hundreds or 100 or so years. But the game itself and the actual Japanese for that interview tell us that it's hundreds, plural.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
So what you're telling me is that you need a job at Nintendo, specifically handling all translations for them into English.
Translator and lore keeper.
Please.
Yes. I wish, but no. However, I do have to say there is a similar situation that takes place between Twilight Princess and Ocarina of Time. Another interview, of course, that mentions 100 or so years between Ganondorf's botched execution and the events of Twilight Princess, and that one is specifically that particular kanji. So it is 100 and some, or 100, like roughly 100 years. And they mention how it takes place parallel to the Wind Waker, and it doesn't seem to take place like in tandem parallel, but more so they're trying to reiterate the sense that they're taking place on two separate timelines, both stemming from the same game. So that like they're running in parallel, but they're not occurring at the same time relative to each other.
Right.
If that makes sense.
So parallel
you're talking about the child and adult timelines?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, to your credit, the child timeline would be 7 years earlier than the adult timeline.
True.
That's true.
While running parallel.
Now, the somewhat related to the conversation prior to that about the Gerudo.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about translations, there is an interview that took place basically around the time Ocarina of Time came out, and we get a little bit of a sense about their biology. Turns out that at the time, and it may still hold true into the present. I mean, they could have soft retconned or something. We're not sure. But at the time, regardless of the father, like regardless of the race of the father, the child would always be 100% Gerudo. So
Yes.
that means whether they were with a Hylian, whether they were with a Goron, like...
That would be interesting.
Yeah, regardless, the child is always Gerudo.
Yes.
And so that begs the question, if that's truly the case, is there any genetic material being shared?
I want to say yes,
Like-
and a great Tears of the Kingdom example is Mattison, who is a Gerudo daughter from a Hylian Gerudo marriage, who
That's true.
is
She's got the hair.
definitely Gerudo, but yeah, her hair and her head shape is 100% Hudson. It's unmistakably Hudson.
That's fair. That's a
Are
fair
you sure?
I am. It is unmistakably.
But
Yeah.
it's interesting. Like, and in addition to that, I mean, we see a lot of Gerudo with Hylian husbands or with Hylian Vo.
Mm-hmm.
But there are references, like in Breath of the Wild, where it was one of the Gerudo travelers mentions, like, I wonder if the Goron's endurance would make them a better match for me. And then there's some that mention about Zora's, and they're like, he's looking pretty good, and it's like, okay.
I
So
don't
if
think
you-
a
if
Zora
you can have
relationship would even work, because they lay eggs, like they're basically amphibious, right? But
I mean, with the Gerudo, who knows how they actually
Apparently,
work it out.
Hylians and Zonai can intermingle.
that's
That's true.
But I have to
That's
wonder,
true.
is the endurance thing more like a lifestyle thing? Because there's this cute NPC couple in Tears of the Kingdom, which I've run into a couple times, and they're a Gerudo Hylian couple who are traveling together. And basically, when you talk to them, they talk about, they love spending time together, traveling and stuff like that. But he just doesn't have stamina to like keep up with her, and to like physically keep up with her traveling. He's just not like as physically fit as her. And there's a moment you can find them on Satori Mountain where they're looking for Endura carrots, because she wants to cook him endurance food so that they can like essentially that he can keep up with her in terms of stamina. And I was like, that's so cute, and it like ties into this game mechanic of like, that this is endurance food, but also like it's, I don't know, it's a cute detail, and they're just a cute couple. And even though she's like almost twice this dude's height, but he's just like, oh yeah, we haven't had much luck finding these carrots, but I just love spending time with her. And I'm like, stop it! This is so awesome.
Yeah,
I love it. So yeah, I have to wonder if it was like an endurance thing in terms of just like, their lifestyle choices, or if it was like a physical trait they want to maybe incorporate into their gene pool somehow. So yeah, it's weird to think, because the biology of like the Zora and the Hylians are pretty cut and dry, understandable, but the Gorons and the Gerudo are like a little more enigmatic that way.
The Gorons are a really interesting case too, because we learn a little bit about them in Tears of the Kingdom.
Yeah, which is
Have
a bit
you-
of a retcon itself as well.
With the two old men talking about
Yeah.
where they were born.
Yeah, that they were born in the cave and that they were born from the land. So they're just like their families, so to speak, seem to just be like whether or not you were born in the same plot of land,
but
instead of like
but then
being
also
blood related.
like Yunobo is like definitively a descendant from both the Goron Sage of Fire and also from Daruk. So there's
From
like
Daruk.
there is a bloodline thing, but
Or
there's
they
also
were,
like
or he was just born in the same exact spot.
yeah,
That's a good point.
that's true.
Yeah, and then to your credit, the term Goron comes from the Japanese onomatopoeia word,
Goro?
I guess Goro, which
Goro.
means to roll.
Yeah.
Yeah.
An interesting thing as well is there's this old interview with the Ocarina of Time script director, I believe it is.
Yes.
Who mentions the Goron's biological sexes being that kind of comparable to the dwarves of Lord of the Rings, in which
Yep.
they're kind of androgynous. So like Gorons do have male and female members of their species, but they're indistinguishable to non-Gorons, and all Gorons just talk like dude bros all the time anyways and call each other brother, so there's like no way for a non-Goron to know if these people are male or female. I find that really interesting, and I don't think that it directly, because that doesn't necessarily, that quote in that interview doesn't necessarily mean that they produce sexually either. That just means that there are male and female Gorons, or it could be that like they do some weird Goron reproductive act and then leave their child, bury their child in the dirt until it gestates and then they emerge from the ground, or like there's so many weird ways you could look at it.
There's a lot of options there for
is.
sure.
It's bonkers weird.
Something that I noticed while you all were talking was about back to Vilya really quick. Vilya has red eyes.
They do.
And the only way I can explain that would be possible Sheikah ancestry in addition to obvious Gerudo ancestry, but that was just a random thought.
That's
Wasn't
true.
trying to delineate the conversation or anything.
No, we can always deviate. I think that's part of the fun of it all, right?
Heck yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean the Gerudo eye color thing is interesting because in classic Zelda games, as we've seen, the Gerudo always have those sort of amber eyes, or like topaz colored eyes. But then by the time of the era of Wild, they have more diverse eye colors, like you would see in Hylians. And I have to wonder if that is one of those things of like, again, like just a lot of intermingling or not. Zelda Wiki, which is a great site, specifically denotes Vilya as being Hylian, which may just be in reference to their stature as well. But like it's hard. I am still personally open to the idea that they happen to be that one Gerudo male. But
I like that idea.
Part of that comes from the fact that in game, some of the other NPCs say, "Oh, I saw a Hylian up on the rooftop," like referring to Vilya, because I'm assuming that they're just assuming their race.
yeah, I think there is
Like,
something to be said for that, because I think there are times where NPCs in these games don't necessarily know what they're talking about.
And they're just using whatever experience they have or information they have, right? So like, if they're unaware that Gerudo even have male children because they're so rare, and you just saw somebody hanging out that kind of had like masculine features but was wearing Gerudo clothing, they'd be like, "Oh, well, they're clearly not Gerudo. They must be Hylian. They've got the build, they've got the ears, right?" So I can see them like assuming, and it also there's in creating a champion, it mentions how they were a Hylian. Like, it also assumes that they're a Hylian who sells Gerudo clothing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they actually are Hylian.
Right.
Like, they haven't outright themselves said, "I'm a Hylian. Hi. Hey, how's it going?"
Right.
So it
Vilya
could
is
go
very
either
coy.
way.
If you give the dialogue response of like, "You're a man," or whatever, "You're a Vo," I can't remember exactly the phrasing. They'll deny it. They're like, "I don't know what you're talking about," right? So it's it's all a little
Yeah.
vague.
Yes.
Yeah, but we should probably circle back to this timeline part of the conversation.
The timeline.
which Wiz, I think you say you have more thoughts on about reconciling these ideas.
Yeah.
And how
I'm trying to figure out. I guess I'm trying to figure out how to introduce this, but just jump into it, I suppose.
Yeah,
but
jump in.
I think we can probably collectively agree that the Great Plateau is where the Rauru and Sonia's kingdom was.
Yes.
Feel free to disagree. Okay. All right.
Agreed.
Cool.
Agreed. Like
So-
you can see it, like
so-
their castle and the Temple of Time.
Yeah. It
is there.
Yeah. When Ganondorf is launching that Molduga attack, he's looking right at the Great Plateau. You can even see the 2 shrines that Link would have to go to in the future. Obviously, they're above ground there, but due to the upheaval, they are below ground at that point in time, or inside of caves, or what have you.
Actually, I talked to Mox about this shrine thing because she pointed that out, of saying she told me that this era can't be before Breath of the Wild, or like it doesn't make sense for it because of those shrines. And I said, actually, I think those shrines in specific are in the Great Sky Islands now, because
Yes.
with the Temple of Time,
there are 4 shrines around the Great Sky Island. There were 4 shrines around the Great Plateau. You see 2 of them there, and they're in the exact same positions as the Sheikah shrines are in Breath of the Wild. And it's clearly a reference to one another.
Yeah.
So yeah. I agree. That's where they went. They went up.
I didn't even think about them going up. I just assumed they went down, since you can find similar
there are
shrines
shrines and
in
caves there around the plateau.
Yeah.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Just
All right.
slightly different locations.
But
yeah.
yeah.
So in the distance, you can see the Temple of Time that goes up into the sky. So this kind of like plays into me placing Tears of the Kingdom's history after Ocarina of Time, but before, or in the split and all those timelines, but before Breath of the Wild. Because I guess my train of thought, or my question that immediately comes to mind, is like, why are there Temple of Time ruins? Granted, we never see them in the memories, but why are there Temple of Time ruins if there's also a Temple of Time that's like up in the sky? Was the Temple of Time that's up in the sky like built, and it's always been there up in the sky, and then human or Hylian Rauru that we know about built the Temple of Time that you see in Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, all that stuff. So I guess it started with that question.
I think that's exactly the answer. I think you're right on the money there.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So going to that point, like that was the question that kind of like started this like thinking, but I guess, or what led to where my theory currently is. But it goes back to this phrase, Hyrule's history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And so all I ask is just consider these things, but consider, because I'm gonna take some leaps here.
Leap. We love the leaps.
So just consider the war that Hylia and Demise were engaged in involved sealing Demise away as the imprisoned. Even though it's not directly mentioned, we could have easily called that war an imprisoning war of sorts based on its outcome. Yeah. So it's an imprisoning war in the shared events, but not in the name, because we don't have it's never mentioned as being called the imprisoning war. We just know the outcome. We have Demise as the imprisoned. Hylia sealed him away. Yada yada yada. Hylia raised Skyloft into the sky. Super important. In the mural, for the prologue for Skyward Sword, we see that Hylia has one person of each race like behind her, and then when you do that optional side quest on top of the Temple of Time in Tears of the Kingdom, the Zonai construct like mentions that Zelda did the same thing. Like she had, I haven't gotten to the point yet, but she had the sages that were there at that time that you see in all the cutscenes, like help her somehow raise all of the landmasses into the sky, including the Temple of Time that we see in the sky. Yeah. In Skyward Sword, if you look at the dome in the ceiling where you can find that big Hylia statue that eventually goes back down into the sealed grounds, symbols. You can see the sage medallions.
Yeah.
So like while they're not mentioned directly in name, they're like their image is shown, and like you can somewhat infer. Obviously, this is speculation, but you can infer that Hylia had help. Like she had sages involved to help her raise like the land masses into the sky.
I agree. Absolutely.
So okay, cool.
Yeah.
In Now, this is where it kind of gets a little crazy. but Lanayru, the dragon, when you go through his like boss rush quest and you defeat all the bosses, he awards you with the Hylian shield that has the Hylian royal crest on it. Now, I know Lorulean's going to hit me with, well, it was called the Land of Hylia. We have the source, like the source lore for it. Like, it was called, like, the Land of Hylia. I guess my challenging question is how does Link get a shield with the Hylian royal crest on it if the kingdom hasn't been founded yet? So does the shield just warp back in time before the kingdom was founded?
The shield is going,
or like
no, that's a good question actually, and my headcanon, which could be wrong, was always the assumption that Lanayru, the Thunder Dragon, specifically made that shield for Skyward Sword's incarnation of Link, and designed it with this Link in mind, and he included a depiction of the Triforce, which some believe Link had within him all this time, or at the very least we know he was destined to get it, and that was part of Hylia's plan for him. And he also included a nice depiction of Link's bird, specifically the red bird. And this is the only instance on this shield, on the Hylian shield, is the only instance in which the Hylian royal crest specifically has the bird being red and the Triforce being golden, as opposed to them matching the same color. So my thought is like Lanayru made this shield for this Link, and it was later adopted in honor of an ancient hero as the royal crest, which is part of why Zonai...
I could get behind that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's totally speculation on my part. It's never confirmed or anything. But that's always been my headcanon. And the Zonai's royal crest seems to be a different one in this ancient era of prosperity as well.
Most definitely.
Yeah, so it's... because that's, again, like the red bird is Link's bird. That's the only like red loftwing in that era. They were thought to be extinct until Link came upon his, right, in Skyward Sword. And then yeah, like every other instance of seeing that Hylian crest on shields, things like that, it's always like the Triforce and the Hylian crest will match in the same color, except for, again, Hylian shield. So where they're distinctly gold and red. There are instances where it's still red. I think the Knight's shield in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is red, but the whole thing is red as opposed to one red, one gold.
So there's also another instance of that crest in Skyward Sword, and it's in Lanayru.
Oh.
It's kind of hard to miss. It's a giant
Temple
statue.
of Time.
Oh, you're right. You are right. You are so right. But the bird's not red. So.
No, it's not. There's no coloration to it, but it is that crest.
You are
the crest
so right.
itself existed
That's
even
true.
in the ancient past.
But of course, that's the
Whether
Temple
or
of
not
Time, where like a site where time travel had some occurrence happening. But so they might have had future knowledge building that place or building that statue, or again, it might be that the royal family just adopted the crest later.
I think these are valid points, and you guys, I was stuck on that for a while and didn't even consider that big royal crest there in the Temple of Time.
I can't believe I forgot that. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it's like right there. It's in your face.
It's like huge. It's massive.
I think it's because it's so big. It's easy to overlook like the symbolism of it because it just looks like it's just part of the scenery. It's so huge. So the crest has always existed.
So where I was going with this was, assuming, and I'm not saying I'm right, but assuming that the history of Tears of the Kingdom takes place after a convergence before Breath of the Wild, much long after all the three timelines. Mm-hmm. Let's we know that a lot of Zeldas, or quite a few Zeldas, take place in these after these collapses of civilization, and almost like these post-apocalyptic environments with a cheery tone added to it. Like, so it's not at the forefront of your mind. You're not necessarily thinking about that being a thing. The Zonai have that different crest. It has 7 secret stones on it, and what stuck out to me, I guess, quite a bit was Rauru saying, Sonia and I are the founders, or the founding king and queen of Hyrule, as far as we know. Like, mentions that one caveat, and that's
Right.
and Lorulean did a translation of it, or maybe Zelda, one of you guys, maybe you guys work together, I'm not sure, but you have that translation that only in my head that solidifies it further for me. Like it's asked as like a question, but like it's said with uncertainty instead of like matter of fact in my head.
I have
or
to
like
wonder
that's how I interpret it.
Because like when he speaks the line in English, I'm not bilingual, but in English it seems like he's kind of being coy about it. He's like, well, at least the last time I checked, right?
Yeah,
but I have to wonder, and Lorulean, maybe you can clarify, like in Japanese, do you know how does that tone kind of convey, like, because the tone can be just as important as the phrasing, right?
Yeah. It kind of comes across as something similar, but yeah, he's posing it sort of like a question. Like, he is posing it as a question. The last bit of his dialogue there.
Right.
I'm gonna see if I can bring it up here.
Could it also be that, like, he's living his life, he's like, yeah, I'm the first king, and then someone shows up and they're like, I'm the daughter of the king. Could it be that he's just having an existential moment of like, what do you mean, what? Like,
Yeah,
maybe,
that's kind of how it came across for me as well. It's kind of like, as far as I was aware, I was the king of Hyrule.
But I thought I was the king.
Yeah. The last part of his phrasing is more like, there shouldn't be any other king other than myself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like there shouldn't be another one other than myself. Like, question? Hello? Excuse me?
Right.
And I've heard the topic debated many a time. Like some have suggested, well, it could just be a refounding. It could be something like what happened in the adult timeline, where they founded Hyrule in a new land.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, yet they reference
good.
Yeah, they reference ancient Hyrule at least more than once. Like Anjin as a Lokomo mentions that the royal line of Hyrule originated in a land referred to as ancient Hyrule.
Mm-hmm.
And they mention how this kingdom was founded only about 100 years ago, but that the family and the kingdom have existed for a long time prior.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if this were a similar situation, why aren't there any references to it? It's like, was there just such a massive span of time, or like such a huge cataclysmic event that like literally wiped out everything from like their collective consciousness as well as historical records? Like, that's why in my opinion, I'm like, it seems to refer to it as being the first founding of Hyrule. But I mean, with how massive the history of the kingdom is, it's possible that it could be. I mean, that it could be a refounding, but it would be at a point where everything else has been completely lost and forgotten about.
Right. I mean, some interesting thing, some food for thought as well, is that Impa in Breath of the Wild talks about the calamity and how it's something that's a cycle. And so we often talk about the great calamity that happened 100 years before Breath of the Wild, and the one that was 10,000 years before Breath of the Wild. But by this point, it's happened a few times. Like, it's not just those two. The kingdom has endured a cycle of calamities that has kept happening. And so there is definitely the chance that with all of these cataclysmic events, like, history is just getting muddled because so many people that would be historians or, bookkeepers or, literal libraries and things are being constantly wiped out by these events.
Yeah, it's like the burning of the Library of Alexandria.
Yeah, exactly. Like there is not a library in Hyrule in Tears of the Kingdom, right?
Medora, where are you?
Yeah. Like they're literally, like, the first school in like 100 years just got built. Which is like tragic, but for this society that's been enduring all of these events. So I think there is definitely something to be said for history getting just muddled from these people's points of view, which is why maybe they don't know in universe that there was more than one Ganondorf. But we as the players with our meta knowledge do know that. But there's also an interesting point about where this takes place. It has to be before, at the very least, before that 10,000 years in which the Sheikah built their technology, because again, like, those ancient Sheikah shrines have been around for 10,000 years, and granted they're gone now I am working on a video talking about that very subject, so I won't get into it too much here, but look forward to that. There's your little tease. But they were built 10,000 years prior to Breath of the Wild and would have just sat there. And we don't see them in the past with Zelda, just like we don't see the dueling peaks being dueling. They're just one peak, single peak.
Yep.
Which is funny because the dueling peaks...
Single peak.
Single peak is the worst name for a mountain. The dueling peaks are in Ocarina of Time, though. So in my head, it's got to be before Ocarina of Time. I don't usually like to use geography as much of a like source of evidence for timeline placement, because the geography is like so wildly inconsistent.
Oh yeah, take Fuse on the entire geography of every single Zelda game.
Yeah,
like the Fuse ability, and that's essentially it's what we have in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom.
But the dueling peaks are like one that they draw a lot of attention to typically in these last two games. You know, it was featured prominently in a lot of Breath of the Wild's marketing, and for them to just change the model of it just for these cutscenes feels to me like too much effort for it to not mean something. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. But again, the dueling peaks are in Ocarina of Time, though many people did not realize that. But they are there in the background of Zora's Fountain. If you go where Jabu Jabu is, the dueling peaks are just there in the background. So they exist in at least that split form by the time of Ocarina of Time, which I still don't know how they got split, but they're there.
It's the greatest mystery in all of Zelda.
Yeah.
I guess the point that I was where I was gonna lead with that I guess questioning Rauru when he says we're the founding king and queen of Hyrule as far as we know. I was just gonna say, you know, Rauru is not infallible, so he's capable of making mistakes.
True.
Because he's not all knowing, and there's two clear examples of this. The first example would be when he wants to keep Ganondorf close because he thinks that he can control him and basically stop him from being from mechanizing a demise of sorts of his kingdom and from causing chaos, which we know Rauru fails at this because obviously Sonia gets kerplunked, and Ganondorf ends up taking her tear and transforming into the Demon King, and all that stuff happens. So that's one example of Rauru getting it wrong. Second time he gets it wrong, that I've made note of is when they've sealed, or they're about to show up to the imprisoning war with Ganondorf, and he shows the sages their tears, and then he has an aside with Zelda, and he says, you know, Zelda, you appeared from a future that doesn't involve her, like you already having traveled to this past, like you come from like a different future.
Right.
And if that were the case, Ganondorf wouldn't recognize Zelda and Link. Corpsedorf wouldn't recognize Zelda and Link when he first sees them and acknowledges who they are. So the point that
further evidence.
That I'm trying to make is that he's not all knowing.
Yeah. Oh, no, I'm agreeing with you here, definitely. And the mural that we see at the beginning of the game, there's a part of it that's covered by rocks. And if you go back there later in the game and break the rocks, you'll see Zelda in the past with the Master Sword, like we send back in time to her, is there already in the mural. So it already existed in that time.
It's already happened.
So yeah, I 100% agree. Rauru said that, but I think he was just maybe trying to, like, you know, put her mind at ease, maybe put his own mind at ease, and yeah, like we mentioned earlier, like there are times I think where NPCs don't know what they're talking about necessarily, because she's the Sage of Time, not him. Sonia had the time control powers, he didn't. So I think he's just trying to like say things to again like kind of put her mind at ease and, you know, make himself a little more comfortable, because he's kind of mentally gearing himself up to face off against Ganondorf as well, right? So he's nervous about it. So yeah, I think, like I said, I jokingly kind of said this to you in one of our Discord chats, Lorulean, where I was saying Calip is just talking out his ass in a couple instances.
Oh my gosh. That guy loves the sound of it.
I definitely think there are times where NPCs say things, but we can't necessarily take that as like 100% like canon fact, because you have to look at it from their in-universe point of view of like, well, how much knowledge do they have about this subject?
That's true.
And in case of Calip, I think his ego is stronger than his repertoire of knowledge. So,
that's fair.
Yeah, but yes. Is there anything else you'd like to add about Rauru here, Wiz? Before I just cut you off there. Sorry.
No, you're fine. That was good conversation for sure. I was just gonna explain basically. This just leads me to believe that, again, supporting my idea or theory of Tears of the Kingdom's history taking place long after the 3 timelines, but before Breath of the Wild. If we say that there was a collapse of civilization, Hyrule went back into tribal communities, so to speak. That's why the Hyruleans look like Aztec warriors. They have all these symbols painted on them. Sonya has the Triforce clearly painted on both of her wrists. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's supposed to signify a certain sealing power that was passed from generation to generation.
Maybe.
And never lost, because if that's one of the most important qualities of your lineage, you should probably keep it in mind or keep it recorded some way, somehow. Yeah, I don't know. That's basically all I wanted to add there with all of that essentially the Zonai coming down and they essentially reestablished order in the Kingdom of Hyrule, assuming that the Kingdom of Hyrule collapsed, mm-hmm. Which we've seen happen several times.
Yeah,
and I think that's all I had to say about that.
For sure. And I as I said before, this is a kingdom that's endured calamity after calamity. Yeah. So I mean, there is credence to that, even if we don't agree on necessarily.
Yeah. No. Honestly, it's a better conversation because we don't agree.
I was hoping we weren't all gonna jump on the same train. So
disagreement is important.
Yes, it is definitely more interesting to chat about. But that people talk about this series, the lore is very surface level or it's not deep or whatever, and I'm like, man, you aren't looking very hard, are you?
Or Zelda doesn't have environmental storytelling.
I hate that.
Get out.
That's all of Breath of the Wild storytelling is.
Please go touch some grass in Hyrule.
It's definitely one of those things where I think that's the best part, is that we can have this conversation because of how rich these games are. But you know what? You brought up what I'm going to say is a great segue to our next topic. We've made it through one topic in an hour and a half.
Jeez.
It's good, and it's an important topic.
It is. So that's why I wanted to start with that one. The Triforce, though. And that will be the topic of discussion for part 2 of this discussion video. Thank you again so much to both Wiz and Lorulean for joining me, and thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to stay tuned for part 2 and 3 of this long discussion that took us 4.5 hours total to record. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you all so much for watching, and an extra big thanks goes to my supporters across both Patreon and here on YouTube as a channel member. So thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Hylian Wes, Justin, Midnight Naomi, and Bunny, as well as so many more people, the names of which you're seeing on screen here. Thank you all so much for all of the support. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.